Lecture 11, East Asia Post-World War II. World War II ended Japan's empire and left Japan in a devastated, uncertain state. After the war, 6.6 million Japanese found themselves without protection in lands of the Allies. Around 575,000 of these Japanese, in particular men, were sent by the Soviets to Siberian labor camps. Many of the stranded Japanese women and children suffered an even worse fate by being killed and or raped by Soviet soldiers. The Chinese also turned on their former overlords by killing Japanese present in Manchuria. Those Japanese who were able to safely return to their homeland encountered a country in the midst of an economic depression. Few jobs, the harsh winter of 1945 to 1946, numerous widows, orphans, and the maimed and crippled of the war. During this time, the U.S., through General Douglas MacArthur, governed Japan from 1945 to 1952. When the U.S. handed back political power to Japan in 1952, Japan not only successfully gained control over its political life and economy, but became one of the world's strongest free market economies with a growth rate from 1947 to 1971 that was number 2 in the world behind the United States. Following our study on post-World War II Japan, we will turn our attention to another East Asia territory, Korea, and to one Southeast Asian country, Vietnam. Both Korea and Vietnam were devastated by a major war. Post-World II Japan. We will begin this section with the internment of Japanese-Americans by the U.S. during World War II. Shortly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, with his Executive Order 9066, authorized the Secretary of War and military commanders to designate military areas in the U.S. in order to protect, and I quote, against espionage and against sabotage, end of quote. As a result of this executive order, all people in the U.S. were determined by the Secretary of War as a threat, all Japanese people, in the U.S. who were determined by the Secretary of War and military commanders as a threat to U.S. national security, were relocated from the western coast of the U.S. to internment camps deeper within the U.S. Within the span of 6 months, about 122,000 men, women, and children of Japanese descent who were living on the U.S. West Coast were relocated to 10 fenced-in guarded camps. The 10 camps were essentially prisons, were located in Wyoming, California, Utah, Arizona, Colorado, and Idaho. And below, in your transcript, I provide an eyewitness account, and I'm going to share with you part of that eyewitness account of the brutal treatment of Japanese in a post-World War II Soviet Siberian work camp. So this is after World War II, their treatment in a Siberian work camp. And I quote, "Our internment camp was built on Siberian tundra. It was said that the internees there numbered 1,000 or 1,500 men. They say that over one winter, 500 men died of illness or starvation. Meals were gruel served in the lids of the men's mess tins. With only this to eat, the men worked on building the roadbed for the railroad or on logging operations. The old Japanese military system was kept as it was, with its generous treatment of higher-ranking officers and poor treatment of lower-ranking younger soldiers. This meant that the younger soldiers were the first to die. The dead bodies were piled up in the empty barracks in the camp. When the men died, they were stripped of their clothes and their bodies froze stiff as logs. Graves couldn't be dug fast enough to keep up with the deaths because the earth in Siberia was frozen. Large bonfires were lit on the frozen tundra to melt the surface. With steel pikes, the earth was dug 1 and 2 millimeters at a time. After a certain depth was reached, a number of bodies were thrown into the pit together. Because they were frozen, the bones broke and shattered. This went on day and night. I will never forget the bonfires lighting up the night sky for as long as I live." End of quote. From the beginning of post-World War II Japanese persecution, Until 1952, the U.S. occupied Japan through the rule of General Douglas MacArthur. During this time, Japan underwent political and economic reforms and was demilitarized. One of the first significant political reforms occurred on January 1st, 1946, when the Japanese emperor formally announced he was not divine but only human. This is currently referred to as the Declaration of Humanity. In it, the emperor asserted this, I quote, "The ties between us and our people have always stood upon mutual trust and affection. They do not depend upon mere legends and myths. They are not predicated on the false conception that the emperor is divine and that the Japanese people are superior to other races and fated to rule the world." End of quote. Near the end of 1946, the emperor promulgated on November 3rd a new constitution, and I provide key excerpts of that constitution in the transcript. Notice there that the emperor promulgated the 1946 constitution. This occurred despite Britain's desire to try the emperor as a war criminal. And if he had, then he couldn't have. The emperor could not have promulgated this 1946 constitution. General MacArthur, though, wanted to keep the emperor in his role in order to keep the country politically stable, and in so doing reduce the danger of communism from gaining power in Japan. In 1952, the U.S. occupation of Japan ended. The Constitution of 1946, though, continued to be the governing document for Japan and still is today. Under this constitution, Japan underwent remarkable economic growth. Factors that contributed to this economic success were both external and internal to Japan. The terms detailing Japan's surrender in 1945, called the Potsdam Declaration, allowed Japan to have continued access, but not control of, raw material it had taken from its former colonies under the condition that the industries Japan uses these material in will not, quote, enable her to rearm for war, end of quote. Internally, as a consequence of the Japanese value of education, Japan was blessed with an educated workforce that developed prior to and during World War II. The mentioned internal and external factors enabled Japan to become, in the 1950s, the world's greatest shipbuilder and a successful exporter of a variety of goods. The Korean War. World War II was followed by two other major wars, the Korean War from 1950 to 1953 and the Vietnam War from 1955 to 1975. The Vietnam War sparked and coincided with Cambodia's Civil War, 1967 to 1975. We will begin with the Korean War. On August 8th of 1945, 2 days after the U.S. dropped an atomic bomb in Hiroshima, and a day before the U.S. dropped an atomic bomb over Nagasaki, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. Then on August 10th, a day after Japan surrendered, the Soviet Union moved troops to northern Korea in order to establish a pro-Soviet Korean government. The Soviet expansion disturbed President Truman and his administration, who had hoped that with Japan defeated, all of Korea would fall under U.S. influence. Since this did not seem likely, the U.S. proposed to Stalin that Korea be divided roughly in half by the 38th parallel north. Stalin agreed to the proposal on August 15th. About 5 years later, on June 25, 1950, the North Korean Army, backed by the Soviet Union and China, invaded South Korea. Even so, this did not amount to, explained the U.S. Secretary of State Dean Acheson, and I quote, a casus belli, a cause of war against the Soviet Union, end of quote. However, Acheson goes on to write, quote, equally plainly, it was an open, undisguised challenge to our internationally accepted position as the protector of South Korea, an area of great importance to the security of American-occupied Japan. End of quote. The U.S. and South Korean troops, with the support of the United Nations, fought back. On July 27, 1953, the war ended basically where it began. Northern Korea remained controlled by a communist Soviet-backed government. South Korea, on the other hand, looked to the U.S. for guidance and developed into a capitalistic, democratic nation. The war casualties were about 1.5 million, 142,000 for the UN, mainly U.S. troops, and about 1 million Koreans. The July 27, 1953 Korean War Armistice Agreement that brought an end to the war stated in its preamble, and I quote, "The undersigned, the Commander-in-Chief, United Nations Command on the one hand, and the Supreme Commander of the Korean People's Army and the Commander of the Chinese People's Volunteers on the other, in the interest of stopping the Korean conflict with its great toll of suffering and bloodshed on both sides, and with the objective of establishing an armistice which will ensure a complete cessation of hostilities and of all acts of armed force in Korea until a final peaceful settlement is achieved, do individually, collectively, and mutually agree to accept and to be bound and governed by the conditions and terms of armistice set forth in the following articles and paragraphs, which said conditions and terms are intended to be purely military in character, to pertain solely to the belligerents in Korea." End of quote. The peace settlement referred to in the preamble you just heard never occurred. In other words, a peace treaty between North Korea and South Korea was never signed. Effectively, this means that the conflict has not ended, but rather is only dormant as a Cold War marked by occasional hot flare-ups. The Vietnam War and Cambodia. The Vietnam War, from 1955 to 1975, was another proxy war between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, as well as being a civil war of Vietnam. As a proxy war, the Soviet Union and the Communist China, through the North Vietnamese, fought the U.S.-backed South Vietnamese military. The U.S. fought in this war for the same reason it fought in the Korean War. This reason is explained in the Truman Doctrine, which was instituted as a reaction to the Greek Civil War that occurred from 1946 to 1949. And it was between communists and anti-communists in Greece. In his March 12, 1947 address before Congress, President Harry S. Truman described this doctrine by stating, and I quote, "One of the primary objectives of the foreign policy of the United States is the creation of conditions in which we and other nations will be able to work out a way of life free from coercion. This was a fundamental issue in war with Germany and Japan. Our victory was won over countries which sought to impose their will and their way of life upon other nations. To ensure the peaceful development of nations free from coercion, the United States has taken a leading part in establishing the United Nations. The United Nations is designed to make possible lasting freedom and independence for all its members. We shall not realize our objectives, however, unless we are willing to help free peoples to maintain their free institutions and their national integrity against aggressive movements that seek to impose upon them totalitarian regimes. This is no more than a frank recognition that totalitarian regimes imposed on free peoples by direct or indirect aggression undermine the foundations of international peace and hence the security of the United States. The peoples of a number of countries of the world have recently had totalitarian regimes forced upon them against their will. The government of the United States has made frequent protests against coercion and intimidation in violation of the Yalta Agreement in Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria. I must also state that in a number of other countries there have been similar developments. At the present moment in world history, nearly every nation must choose between alternative ways of life. The choice is too often not a free one. One way of life is based upon the will of the majority, and is distinguished by free institutions, representative government, free elections, guarantees of individual liberty, freedom of speech and religion, and freedom from political oppression. The second way of life is based upon the will of a minority, forcibly imposed upon the majority. It relies upon terror and oppression, a controlled press and radio, fixed elections, and the suppression of personal freedoms. I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free people who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. I believe that we must assist free peoples to work out their own destinies in their own way." End of quote. In accordance with the Truman Doctrine, the U.S. aided South Vietnam in order to prevent a totalitarian communist regime in gaining control over Vietnam. Despite South Vietnam's military defense of their land as aided by the U.S., in 1975, North Vietnam successfully defeated South Vietnam and then united Vietnam as one country under a communist government. During a good part of the Vietnam War, a civil war also erupted in Cambodia, lasted from 1967 to 1975. The two sides of the Cambodian Civil War was the Community Khmer Rouge Party, supported by North Vietnam, and the Kingdom of Cambodia, supported by the U.S. and South Vietnam. The Civil War was followed by a systematic political slaughter led by Pol Pot's party that was responsible for the deaths of 1 to 3 million people, of which around 200,000 were executed and the rest died from starvation, overwork, disease, and torture. The genocide ended when the Vietnamese Communist government invaded Cambodia and successfully ended this atrocity. A brief overview of Cambodia's recent history will help to understand why the genocide occurred. From 1863 to 1953, Cambodia was a protectorate of France through the French colony of French Indochina. Its protectorate status was interfered for a few years during World War II, when from 1941 to 1945 the Japanese occupied Cambodia. In 1953, Cambodia gained its independence and became ruled by Norodom Sihanouk. Even though Sihanouk was interested in a constitutional monarchy, he chose instead to rule as a strong authoritarian king. His reign lasted until 1970, the year when he was ousted from power. During the Vietnam War, Cambodia engaged in a civil war from 1970 to 1975 between communists led by Pol Pot and the constitutional monarchy. Pol Pot was aided by China, the Soviets, and by Czechoslovakia. The war ended with Pol Pot and his Communist Party, the Khmer Rouge, as the victors. In 1976, Pol Pot began instituting a totalitarian regime in which people in the country were forced into farming labor camps. In explaining why he did this, he asserted, and I quote, "We take agriculture as the basic factor and use the fruits of agriculture to systematically build industry in order to advance toward rapidly transforming a Cambodia marked by a backward agriculture into a Cambodia marked by a modernized agriculture. We also intend to rapidly transform the backward agriculture of Cambodia into an industrialized Cambodia. This resulted in a national society characterized by equality, justice, genuine democracy, and the absence of the rich, poor, exploiting, and exploited classes, and in an independent, united, peaceful, neutral, non-aligned, and sovereign Cambodia with full territorial integrity." In order to do so, his party systematically killed those they believed could make this political goal less likely to achieve. Those killed in accordance with the slogan, "Keeping urban dwellers is no benefit, losing them is no loss," were people who criticized the party, foreigners, people who had an education above grade 7, people who wore glasses, and even people found guilty of publicly recalling their memories. Pol Pot also saw the use as an important means by which to institute his perfect society, since they knew very little and could, he believed, be quickly made to believe in his vision. In 1978, Vietnam invaded Cambodia and ended the mass killings and brought an end of illegal border crossings from Cambodia into Vietnam. The illegal border crossings that especially infuriated the Vietnamese were done by Khmer Rouge guerrillas, who violently raided Vietnamese villages and in so doing displaced around 500,000 Vietnamese. In 1993, the UN helped to monitor elections and establish a multi-party democracy. In the process, King Norodom Sihanouk was reinstated as King of Cambodia of a constitutional monarchy. God bless.